Bryant and Blade locked eyes with such bitter intensity, Wes was sure it could be felt over the airwaves. Ross stood quietly in a corner of the studio. "Ross, please pick up that microphone and put it back in its stand," Wes said. All the while, Blade's eyes never left Wes. "I risk losing the audience by this silence," Wes thought. "But I suspect the listeners are so riveted by what they picture is going on here in the studio, they're not likely to be turning their dials." "Just exactly who are you threatening when you refer to a sacrifice for Abaddon?" "You'll find out on October 31st, if you've got the guts to use those concert tickets I gave you. All will be revealed then." The door to Studio A eased open, and Darlene slid the lab report on the decanter of blood that had been taken from Blade's limo the night before. After looking at it, Wes slipped it in his shirt pocket and shook his head in disgust. "Where did you get the human blood you were drinking in the limousine last night?" Blade threw his head back and let out a guttural laugh. "Let's just say a friend donated it." "Dead or alive?" A sneer rippled across Blade's lips. "If he was alive, his devotion to Abaddon was voluntary. If he was dead, his reward from Abaddon will be great. Otherwise, it's none of your business." Wes leaned forward with his chin supported by his raised right palm. "We keep hearing about Abaddon, but you're awfully skimpy on details. So let's get specific. Is Abaddon from the past or the present?" "He's timeless," Blade shot back. "Longer than man can remember, beyond what man might envision." "Is he human?" "That depends," Blade answered. "No, if he chooses to haunt the night of sacrifice. And yes, if he desires a body." Wes glanced at the computer screen on his right and saw a full lineup of callers. "Let's go to our audience. The first caller from Woodlake says his name is Exterminator. You're on the air with Clint Blade." "Die, Bryant," Exterminator said. "You don't deserve to live." Wes said defiantly, "How about you, Blade? You want me dead too?" "The Biblio-Satanist says to rejoice if the world is rid of a menace like you." Wes turned and grabbed a black leather-bound book from the midst of several volumes and cults that Ross had brought to the studio. Ross traced 2 6s in the air with his index finger. Wes thumbed to page 66. A headline jumped out at him. "Instructions on the qualification for a suitable sacrifice." "Is this what you call sacred?" Wes asked Blade. "Folks," he went on, addressing the audience, "I've got a how-to manual on black magic in my hands called Biblio-Satanus, and I'm looking at page 66. Here's what it says, quote, 'There are 2 kinds of offerings suitable for the ancient ones. First, a virginal innocent, selected because she is untainted and can be defiled most unholy. Second, an enemy of Abaddon, a pest, worthy of the most vile debasement and torment.'" Close quote. Wes punched in the next caller Sally had selected. "Heather, thanks for waiting," Wes said. "Since we're talking with a lady, maybe we'll get some ladylike comments. Go ahead." "Am I on the air?" a quiet voice asked. "Yes, do you want to talk to Clint Blade?" "Sort of. Well, I need to ask him some things." "You sound very young," Wes probed. "I'm 11, and Mr. Blade was very bad to me." Wes watched Blade rise from his slumping position, move his earphone slightly, and stare into the microphone. Heather spoke more forcefully. "Mr. Blade, you were bad to me." Blade's mouth twitched. "I don't know who this is." "You do know me," Heather said. "I was with you." Heather's voice broke into heaving sobs. "Bryant, either get rid of this idiot or this interview is over," Blade insisted. This girl has something on Blade. He's scared to talk to her, Wes sensed. Wes answered, "With or without you, Heather's going to have her say." Ross pointed to the clock, and Wes realized he had skipped 2 commercial breaks. "It sounds like Heather needs a break. We'll be right back after this message," Wes explained. Moments ago, we were talking with a caller named Heather who said something about Blade being bad to her. Heather, where were you when this happened? In his big car, Heather said. The one with the TV and big seats inside. Sounds like your limousine, Blade, Wes pointed out. What did Mr. Blade do, Heather? The things that boys do to girls, you know, Heather explained with a hushed voice. The phone line was silent except for Heather's whimpering. She sniffled several times and then said, He made me drink that stuff. He said it was prepared before the ashes, whatever that means. The ashes? Wes questioned. Yes, Heather answered. That's why I can prove what he did. Mr. Blade gave me a little bowl to take with me. Mr. Blade said to think of Abaddon every time I saw the ashes in the bowl. Clint Blade's face went blank, frozen in a state of surprise and fear. Wes had him cornered. Blade and Wes were frozen. The airways were silent. Someone had to do something. Ross Benson jumped behind the console, nudged Wes aside, shoved a couple of carts in the machines to kick off a final commercial and the closing jingle for the show. Unable to contain his rage any longer, Wes lunged over the top of the console toward Blade and knocked him backward out of his chair. The two policemen entered the fray and were trying to separate them. Wes felt a sharp jerk in his left arm and then his right. Handcuffs clicked together behind his back. From the corner of his eye, he saw the other officer had done the same thing to Blade. The two men lay pinned to the ground, restrained by the officer's handcuffs, when Wes's thoughts raced to Heather. Is she still on the line? I've got to talk with her. Ross, Heather was in line 6. Check it, quick. Ross raced toward the console and looked at the teleface closely. She's gone, Ross said. All the other lines are jammed with callers who probably think they can still get on the air, but Heather's line has gone dead. Just get me to a phone so I could call my attorney, Blade threatened. Mark had appeared on the scene. For what? Mark responded. You're not under arrest. Frankly, you'd better be glad Heather hung up, because if we could trace that call, we would. She's lying, I told you, Blade shot back. Maybe, Mark replied. But if she isn't, you'd better watch your step. You already have a date with the judge for hitting that officer. Blade threw his left shoulder forward, momentarily freeing his arm. You'd be surprised what kind of friends I have in high places. Like Ed Reimer? Wes interjected. Blade seemed taken back by the remark, then rebounded in a clipped voice. I don't know who you're talking about. Don't play dumb with me, Blade, Wes shouted. He was at the Mile High Hotel. The officers shoved Blade out of the studio with Ross Benson behind them. Mark released Wes's handcuffs. I've been wanting to talk to you about Ed Reimer, Mark said. He's been under surveillance by our narcotics unit for weeks, but it's a touchy situation. The district attorney doesn't want us moving in until we've got an ironclad case. If we're not very careful, the whole department could be held responsible for interfering in the election. Wes picked up Blade's overturned chair and slumped into it. Why would Reimer risk his political reputation by being involved with drug dealing, he asked. It's not just drugs, Mark replied. Running coke and heroin is the financial pipeline for more serious stuff. Let's go to my office, where it's more private, Wes said. Wes started to step away when Darlene motioned for him to wait. Boss? That girl Heather. She sounded sincere, like Blade really had done something to her. I know, Wes said, starting down the hallway. Boss, wait, Darlene added. It was uncanny. What I mean to say is, except for a childlike quality to her voice, she sounded just like Jennifer. The day of Jennifer's second session with Dr. Brown, Wes arose early. He wanted to sit and think about what might happen later at Dr. Brown's office. As the frost began to clear from the windshield, he saw Annette rush out of the house. She waved at Wes, then turned back toward the door and called for Jennifer. Annette tried to smooth Jennifer's hair as she rushed past her toward the car, but Jennifer veered away and gave her mother a look of disgust. What's wrong with you today? Wes demanded of Jennifer as she got into the car. Jennifer stared straight ahead, then suddenly seemed to snap out of her mood. Sorry. I had an awful dream about an evil dark lady who was trying to strangle me. Jennifer shivered as she recounted the nightmare. I was remembering the moment when her long fingernails grabbed my throat when Mom reached out to touch me. This lady was wearing a black velvet robe. When she opened it, she threw out her arms and tried to choke me. After that, I heard the sound of wings flapping. That was the first thing Wes told Dr. Brown when they walked into his office. It could have been Lilith, Dr. Brown agreed. She's a very dangerous alter and might try to manipulate Jennifer's emotions by haunting her dreams. Lilith's increased activity signals that there's a fight for control inside Jennifer's personality system. My, are we upset? A deeply resonating woman's voice arrogantly asked. Wes looked at Jennifer and recognized Lilith's personality. Yes, I'm angry at never knowing from one minute to the next who I'm talking to, Wes said. That's why we keep switching, Lilith said confidently. There are too many of us for you to defeat. Don't be so confident, Dr. Brown interrupted. I've successfully integrated the personalities of cases more severe than this. Perhaps you have. You may even know about the Order of the Dark Raven. But have you ever encountered its elite level of operation? The Federation? Lilith challenged. Ah, yes, the Federation, Dr. Brown said knowingly. I've heard about your exploits from your victims, but I've never met an alter who could tell me much about that venerable institution. I can. Suddenly, Lilith's eyes rolled back in her head and she clasped her throat. She thrashed back and forth in the chair as if trying to release herself from the grip of some unseen strangling force. Whoever tried to choke Lilith caused Jennifer's body to stiffen as if rigor mortis had set in. For a moment, she appeared lifeless. Her eyes opened, and a voice said, Lilith has been warned never to speak of these things. She will be punished. Dr. Brown seemed to understand what was happening. Mr. and Mrs. Bryant, you've met some of Jennifer's alters. Now I'd like to introduce you to an evil attachment. A hideous laugh erupted from inside Jennifer's body. I am Asmodeus, servant of Abaddon and executor of the Federation's High Council. This isn't an ordinary supernatural state, Dr. Brown said. Asmodeus is said to be part human and part spirit. Quite right, Dr. Brown, Asmodeus responded. In the meantime, have you met my friends? If you're referring to the alters, yes, we have. Good. Unlike them, you can't fuse me into the core of Jennifer. I don't respond to psychotherapy, so you might as well put aside your Freudian tricks. Dr. Brown turned to his bookshelf. He went to a black leather-bound volume. He pointed it at Asmodeus, who winced at the sight of it. This book is all I need to deal with you. Dr. Brown laid the Bible on his desk, glaring at Asmodeus as he returned to his seat. You think you're in control of what happens to Jennifer, but we both know who truly controls all these circumstances. He pointed at Annette's cross. The battle is his, not ours. Suddenly Asmodeus disappeared and Jennifer was back. Jennifer, Dr. Brown said, I'd like to talk to your parents by themselves. We have a special room with all sorts of videos to watch, and I'm sure my receptionist, Margaret, would like to join you. Really? Jennifer said, her eyes lit up. That's great! She turned to Annette and touched her arm. Don't worry about me, Mom. Dr. Brown walked to a small white message board next to his bookcase and picked up a blue marker. I suppose you're wondering where we go from here. Our task is to show the alters that Jennifer's safety has been achieved and their separateness has lost its usefulness. How long will this take? Wes inquired. I'm assuming this can't be resolved overnight. Jennifer will need to be in therapy on a weekly basis for at least a year, but once the healing begins, positive feelings will replace the negative ones, Dr. Brown explained. We'll begin by finding which alters can be integrated. Then we'll work with them. Asmodeus, Wes asked. What about him? Ah, Asmodeus, Dr. Brown said, frowning slightly. He's a different matter. I need to think about him a little more. He reached for the Bible, held it a moment, then flipped through its pages. Then he turned back to Wes and Annette. If there are no more questions, I'll show you the way out. I'd like to say goodbye to Jennifer. This way, please. Dr. Brown! A voice yelled from the other side. Come quickly! Without a word, the doctor rushed to the door and pushed it open. Wes saw the receptionist, Margaret, sitting on the floor next to Jennifer. We were watching an old cartoon on video, Margaret said. You know what a fan I am of the original Walt Disney characters. I just put in a video of Mickey Mouse when Jennifer said she was losing her sight and hearing. Dr. Brown bent down and looked into Jennifer's eyes. Don't panic, he said, reassuringly placing his hand on Annette's shoulder. This is a temporary state. The cult programmed a deaf-mute altar to prevent the victim from exposing the cult's secret tactics. The distressed look on Margaret's face told Wes that despite the number of clients she had seen, Jennifer's case was unique. Mickey Mouse, Margaret murmured. We were watching Mickey Mouse. Dr. Brown raised his eyebrows and snapped his fingers. Yes, of course, Mickey Mouse. He paced across the room several times. This is just a hunch, you understand, but cartoon characters are sometimes used by cults as triggers. Dr. Brown! Margaret exclaimed as she stood to her feet and moved toward the door. Mary Hanahan has that box of toys she uses with sand tray therapy. I remember seeing some stuffed animals in her office, and if I'm correct, one of them is a Mickey Mouse doll. I'll check. Splendid, Dr. Brown responded as Margaret raced out of the room. Who's this Mary with the stuffed animals? Wes inquired. My clinical associate. She does a marvelous job with patients whose abuse is so severe they are incapable of vocalizing it. She uses a type of play therapy to break through their denial by providing the clients with a tray of sand and small figurines. I found it, Margaret said as she burst into the room, holding a fuzzy black and white Mickey Mouse doll. Jennifer should be able to identify this character by touch, Dr. Brown said, taking the doll from Margaret, kneeling beside Jennifer. If she can comprehend that Mickey Mouse is cuddly and not threatening, that realization may force her deaf-mute altar to submerge. Dr. Brown took Jennifer's hands in his and placed the doll in her lap. Jennifer hesitantly began stroking the doll. Her fingers explored its shape, and she outlined the contour of the mouse's ears. A puzzled but somber look crossed her face. She blinked several times and squinted her eyes as if she were trying to focus them. All at once, Jennifer was back. Wes raced past other cars in the freeway. He had taken Annette and Jennifer home. There was so much to tell his police officer's son-in-law that Wes had called him and asked Mark to meet him at the station. Before he knew it, Wes was pulling into the parking lot of the Executive Plaza building. When the doors of the elevator opened, he saw Mark sitting in the KBCE reception area. You won't believe what happened this morning at Dr. Brown's office, Wes said as Mark pulled a chair close to the desk and sat down. I encountered a demon. This evil thing called itself Asmodeus and has some sort of control over Jennifer. The whole thing was pretty terrifying, and I had to talk to someone about it. I didn't want to upset Annette, and I certainly couldn't discuss it with Jennifer, so I called you. Dr. Brown called me right after your session this morning, Mark said. He didn't break any professional confidences, but he wants me to attend your next session, if it's okay with you. Because I'm family, he did tell me some of what happened. You mean you know about the altars and Asmodeus? Only the altars, Mark said. I have no objections, but does Dr. Brown want you there? Mark glanced downward, as if hesitating to respond. Then he looked up and said, Alistair said he might eventually need my help with an exorcism. An exorcism, Wes said, on Jennifer? Apparently. My guess is that my old friend from seminary knew if he told me it involved Asmodeus, I wouldn't agree to join you. Wes settled into his chair and shook his head. Something is missing here. What's between you and Dr. Brown? I never said anything to you and Annette about my days in seminary. Anyway, something happened at seminary that changed my mind about the ministry. Alistair and I encountered an older student by the name of Edward Maxwell, a pastor in his 40s who said he was back in seminary for continuing education. We discovered that he wasn't there for the right reasons. To make a long story short, he was an infiltrator, someone a cult sends to the other side, a spy to create havoc. Maxwell was always saying something to cause trouble for one student or another, so one time Alistair and I confronted him. After we put a lot of pressure on him, he admitted he had been paid to penetrate the student body and turn seminarians away from their calling and away from God. Why was that a problem? Wes asked. Weren't your professors glad to have the plot exposed? That's what Alistair and I thought would happen, Mark agreed, but infiltrators are clever. One night in the men's dormitory, Alistair and I challenged Maxwell to confess the truth. Before we knew it, we weren't talking to him, but someone else inside Maxwell who called himself Asmodeus. He told us all about the Federation. Don't you see, Wes? That's why I joined the Occult Crime Task Force. The Federation is behind the drug dealing in the city. They infiltrate every power structure possible. The medical profession, the legal profession, even religious denominations. Wes stood up. The seminary should have commended you for uncovering such a heinous plot, he said with conviction. They might have, if I had handled things more wisely. Alistair wanted to get the approval of our professors first, but I insisted we expel Asmodeus by ourselves. And what happened? We weren't able to finish the exorcism. Alistair was right, Mark explained. When the dean found out what had happened, he dismissed me without allowing me to defend myself. They excused Alistair because he was Kenyan, and they didn't want to do anything that would damage the image of their foreign student program. Mark's eyes were filled with tears as he reached for his handkerchief. Wes put an arm around Mark's shoulder. The officer slowly regained his composure and said, I've turned my back on God and his calling. How can I face Asmodeus? The two men looked at each other, unable to answer the question. Darlene's voice came over the intercom. Boss, your wife is on the line and she says it's urgent. Wes put the receiver to his ear. Annette, is something wrong? Mark's here in the office with me. It's Jennifer, Annette cried. Oh, Wes, I never should have allowed her to go to school this afternoon. The counselor says she skipped her class after I left. No one knows where she is. Please calm down, sweetheart. Mark and I will go look for her, but let's not panic. Boss, Darlene's voice called out again over the intercom. Dr. Brown is on the phone. Is he anyone you know? He says it's important. Wes picked up the receiver. Put him straight through, he said. Moments later, the intercom buzzed, and Wes punched the auto-search button that locked on the line that was flashing. Wes, Dr. Brown said in an agitated voice, I've been thinking about Jennifer's system of altars, and it's just occurred to me that Heather, the child's voice who called during your talk show a week ago, is most likely the personality the cult has programmed to return to the ceremonies. That's how Blade was able to sexually abuse Jennifer in his limousine. The Federation triggered Heather to come out and go to where Blade was waiting for her. Wes swung the phone cord back and forth nervously. Isn't there something we can do to put a stop to all of this? I know it's going to take a long time, I understand that. But Jennifer needs our help now. Annette just called to tell me that Jennifer is missing from school. Do you have any idea where she might be? Wes suddenly remembered the Kazoo contest. Wait a minute, Wes interrupted himself. There's a chance she and her friends might be checking out that guy in the coffin. If I remember correctly, tonight's the night. I have no idea where the coffin is. I do, Mark interrupted. It's in an old haunted house. It's worth a try to check out the place, Dr. Brown suggested. Mind if I come along? I'll pick you up in 30 minutes, Wes said. Oh, one more thing. At the session this morning, Asmodeus called himself the executor. Coincidentally, just last Wednesday, someone stopped by the office and told the receptionist that he was the executive. After his visit, everything seemed to go wrong. That doesn't surprise me in the least, Dr. Brown said. Your receptionist probably didn't understand that Asmodeus was calling himself the executor and not the executive. But Asmodeus was a demon, Wes argued. He wasn't a human being. How could he appear in the flesh? Wes, my dear friend, Dr. Brown said, demons can do strange things. In Kenya, the witch doctors claimed the ability to appear and disappear at will, sometimes in different parts of the country, all within a matter of seconds. Wes hung up the phone and turned his attention to Mark, who was looking through the night sacrifice folder. I'm assuming you can come along and lead us to the haunted house. Mark replied, Yes, I can show you where it is. Our occult crime task force is going to have some plainclothes officers in unmarked cars keeping an eye on the place tonight. We've heard all kinds of rumors about rituals that go on there. Mark closed the night sacrifice file and laid it back on Wes's desk. Edward Maxwell, Mark said. I'd almost forgotten about him until today. That's the infiltrator at seminary, right? Wes asked. Yes, but it's Jonathan Maxwell who should concern us, Mark answered. Jonathan Maxwell is Edward's son, and Jonathan Maxwell's stage name is Clint Blade. The unlikely trio, Wes, Mark, and Dr. Brown, who was in the back seat, made their way down Gold Mine Road toward Kayzu's haunted house as an autumn dusk settled on the city. In the rearview mirror, Wes saw the glow of office lights twinkle as Denver's skyscrapers came to life. Wes was tense, hoping Annette would call any minute and say Jennifer was safely home. Gold Mine Road began climbing into the Rocky Mountain foothills. Wes turned onto a dirt road and drove slowly down the narrow lane lined with tall aspen trees, expecting one of the creatures in his dream to come swooping down from the leafless tree limbs. In the dim light, he saw two monstrous carved marble statues perched on pillars about 8 feet high. They faced each other on either side of the arched entryway, and resembled gargoyles, the creatures that adorned the walls of medieval castles. Abaddon, Wes realized, as his eyes focused on the moonlight glistening off the wings and talons of the beasts. Massive iron gates that hung from the pillars to secure the estate's grounds betrayed their purpose and hung wide open. The stone sentries seemed to dare outsiders to enter, causing the three men to hesitate, each waiting for the other to make the first move. Mark stepped forward, then pointed beyond the wall. "Look at that," he whispered. Following his gaze, Wes and Dr. Brown saw a stately stone mansion. The three strained to get a better view of the mansion's massive width and height. Set on a rocky rise, the manor, with its turrets and masonry, looked like one of those citadels of fear classically portrayed in old horror movies. The house was surrounded by a dozen or so cars. There appeared to be little light inside, except for a faint glow coming from a second-floor window. Worn shutters hung precariously on broken hinges. "I thought you said some guys from your task force were going to keep an eye on this place," Wes said to Mark. "Oh, I'm sure they're around here somewhere," Mark responded. "I saw a couple of our unmarked cars parked a mile or so back down the road. They may have walked the rest of the way. They're probably hiding in the woods." "I'll take the lead," Wes said as he made his way cautiously up a winding slate walkway that led from the driveway. "Since I'm in the radio business, I can explain that I'm here to check out the competition. I'll say the two of you are friends, along for the ride." The closer they got to the house, the more clearly the sounds of night sacrifice music could be heard. The massive front door was open about 6 inches. They stepped into an entryway illuminated only by the faint beam of a candle. About 6 feet off the floor, on the wall opposite the main entry, were words painted in bright red Gothic lettering. "Abandon hope, all who enter here. Dante." Under the inscription, Wes could see the outline of a human skull lying on the table. He took several steps forward and reached down to touch the bony remains. The skull was sitting on a book. He carefully nudged the skull aside so he could see the bold embossed inscription on the front of the volume. Biblio Satanas. They stepped into a small room. Walls, ceiling, and floor were all pitch black, except for a white symbol about a foot in diameter on the far wall. As Wes stepped closer, he was taken back by the sight of Abaddon's outline, just as it had appeared on Clint Blade's T-shirt. On either side were wall-mounted candelabras with half-melted black candles. Wes led his party to another door, pushed the door open, and found a large foyer, illuminated by candlelight, dominated by a wide staircase. They began walking up the steps. When they reached the uppermost step, the night sacrifice music stopped, and the sounds of low, deliberate chanting could be heard. Sued Omsa. Sued Omsa. The voices cried louder and louder, as if the petitioners were entering a frenzied state. Then the sound of a gong. The voices faded into a whisper. Behind the door, sounds of low moanings arose. Gradually one voice began to predominate, and its groanings grew louder and louder. Then a screech pierced the air. Wes reached the door, frightened at what he might find. Hesitation faded, as he remembered the scene of Jennifer at the Mile High Hotel crying out, "Abaddon, I am yours." Wes put his hand on the door, and it swung inward. The door was filled with a dozen or so robed and hooded people. In a corner, one of the participants beat slowly, methodically on a drum, as if invoking some kind of rhythm that kept those in the room hypnotized. On the other side of the room, a large man stood with a gun, an AK-47, in his arms. "Even from behind, I can tell that's the guy who assaulted me and knocked me out at the Mile High Hotel," Wes observed. They watched as one of the cloaked participants stepped forward and lifted a long knife blade in the air. He pointed it toward a coffin in the corner. The coffin was tilted slightly so the body inside could be seen, but in the dim light, Wes couldn't make an identification. "Sued Omsa! Sued Omsa!" everyone cried. Sued Omsa. Asmodeus! Wes realized. They're saying Asmodeus backward, and that shriek must have meant Abaddon's arrival. "I yield myself to you, executor of the High Council," the leader with the blade intoned. "We present your servant, Eddie Daly." Wes tried to position himself so he could see what was happening. The leader approached the coffin and poised the blade above it. Eddie Daly, Wes thought. That's the kid who won the Kazoo contest to have the right to sleep in the coffin. Suddenly, the leader with the blade turned around and fixed his eyes toward the back of the room where Wes was standing. Hanson Anderson. He's the general manager of Kazoo. Wes recognized him immediately. Anderson, in some sort of trance, looked right through Wes, oblivious to anything in the room. "The night of sacrifice has arrived, and Abaddon's presence honors us," Anderson said. Anderson took one of the burning black candles from a candelabra near the casket. "Abaddon, receive your servant," Anderson declared as he passed the flame slowly up the body from the feet toward the head. Then Anderson paused with the flame directly above the face. "That's not Eddie Daly, whoever he is," Wes realized. "That's the bellhop at the Mile High Hotel, Randy Ingram." Just as Wes identified the body in the coffin, a shot rang out. The participants jumped to their feet and wheeled around to face the door. All of them, including the bodyguard with the automatic weapon, lay their eyes on Wes, Mark, and Dr. Brown. Wes recognized several faces from Andrea's black bunch. "Wes Bryant!" Anderson called out and flashed a false grin as he tried to inconspicuously drop the knife next to the coffin. "How did you find out where we'd be conducting our little public relations gimmick? Hey, if you're going to top Kazoo in the ratings, you'll have to do more than sneak in on a stunt like this." "That shot sure startled everyone," Anderson said as he motioned for two of the male participants to carry the coffin into another room. "Must be some elk hunters. Hope it doesn't wake up old Eddie," he laughed. Does he really believe that's Eddie in the coffin? Wes wondered. "So, Anderson, what's this little gathering all about?" West asked nonchalantly. "You've been hyping this contest for more than a week. I couldn't resist seeing what you were up to." Anderson took West by the arm and directed the three men toward the exit. As they stepped into the hallway, he secured the door behind them. "Pretty realistic, wasn't it?" he explained and let out a rehearsed chuckle. "Well, gentlemen, the party is over, so I guess it's time for you to leave," Anderson said. Wes and his companions got in the car, and Wes started the engine. He backed up and made his way down the dirt road. "Mark," he said, "Eddie Daly was the kid who won the Kazoo contest. He was supposed to have the honor of lying in the coffin, but it wasn't Daly, it was Randy—" "Ingram," Mark interrupted to Wes's surprise. "His roommate reported him missing this morning, and we've had a bulletin out on him. How did you know who he was?" "I met him that night at Blade's Hotel," Wes answered. "He was an enthusiastic Night Sacrifice fan." "Was. A fan is right." "Was?" Wes asked. "That guy in the coffin was dead," Mark said. "Believe me, I know a stiff when I see one." Wes stopped the car, and Mark rolled down his window, put his fingers to his mouth, and let out a sound somewhat like an owl's hoo. Seconds later, a man dressed in combat fatigue stepped from the edge of the woods. Mark got out of the car and talked to him, then got back in the car. "According to Sergeant Miller, Lieutenant Henderson has been wounded. He was behind the mansion checking out sounds he heard coming from near the mine entrance and was hit by gunfire," Mark said, lowering his head. "An ambulance is on the way to pick him up. Wes, you and Alistair head back to town. Miller and I may have to go back in, and that means risking more lives. The SWAT team will be arriving within minutes, and the entire area will be cordoned off." "We've got to surprise them," Mark said. "That means most of the SWAT team unit will need to stay behind and allow only a few of us to penetrate the target area." "If they catch you, we'll have a serious hostage standoff," Miller warned. "It's a risk we'll have to take," Mark decided. "Get me a shoulder holster and a .357. Tell the others what we'll be doing. If you hear gunfire, they're to move in quickly. Explain the potential hostage situation. Go on, I'll wait here." As Miller crept off, Wes turned to Mark. "Please, let me go with you, for Jennifer's sake." "No," Mark shot back. "It's out of the question." "Mark," Dr. Brown added, "this isn't a war of flesh and blood. Whatever is in that house is more powerful than any bullet, and unless you go in there armed with God, you're risking a lot more than your life. You're putting your soul in jeopardy." Mark smiled and wrapped his right arm around Dr. Brown's neck. "Thanks, Alistair," he said. "I've packed a pistol for so long, I'd forgotten to pack my prayers. Come on, we're all going in." Mark gave everyone brief instructions about what he was going to do. Then he led the way, followed by Sergeant Miller, Wes, and Dr. Brown. They crept through the dense ponderosa pine, stopping within 50 feet of the mansion. Minutes earlier, a half a dozen SWAT team members had dispersed around the perimeter, and they were now in position. They crouched behind the natural blind of trees. When they reached the edge of the woods, Mark gave hand signals for them to traverse the tree line until they were at the closest point to the house, about 30 yards. The back door of the house was about 25 yards from the opening of the mine. Mark waved his arm for the team to position themselves at its entry, which was covered with fallen beams and rocks, before launching an assault on the house. In the split second before Mark gave the signal, something caught Wes's eye. It was a gleam of light from inside the mine. As the others charged toward the back door of the mansion, Wes hesitated and looked deeper into the shaft. Something compelled him to enter the mine. He got down on all fours and scaled the rocks and fallen timbers, making his way inside the tunnel. The dim light grew brighter as he moved farther. About 20 feet in, he saw another shaft diverging to his right, and from the faint stream of light he could see a small cavern and what appeared to be 30 or 40 bales of hay wrapped in burlap. "Looks like I found a drug cache," Wes noted. Farther into the mine, he realized the beam of light was coming from a tributary shaft that angled about 30 degrees to his left. As he rounded a corner, he almost walked headfirst into a set of double doors. "What in the world is this?" Wes wondered in bewilderment. He jerked the doors open. Instead of finding a dirt-laden, cobweb-infested cavern, he beheld an extravagantly furnished library.
This concludes this side. Please fast forward the cassette to the end and turn the tape over for the continuation of the program.